Before Steaua Bucharest and Red Star Belgrade, there was another team flying the flag for Eastern European football in the European Cup. Whilst they might be the less famous Belgrade team, it was in fact Partizan who became the first European Cup finalist to hail from the East in an antidote to the rampant success that came from Madrid, Lisbon and Milan. This is how they did it. Partizan Belgrade won two of the first four titles under this new country that people were starting to call Yugoslavia. In 1947 they claimed the title from Dinamo Zagreb by 5 points, which doesn't sound incredibly impressive until you peel the curtain back and realise they only dropped 5 points in winning the championship. They outscored everyone and outdefended everyone to be the undisputed Yugoslavian football champions. Unfortunately, there wasn't an available route for Partizan to show the rest of Europe, neither then or in 1949 after they pipped their closest rivals both geographically and competitively in Red Star by 3 points. But just as the dawn of the 1950s was the dawn of a new era for a more unified European football, it was also the dawn of Partizan Belgrade having to settle for silver in most instances. In 1954 they were beaten to the championship by Dinamo Zagreb by a single point, which has its roots firmly in a 2-0 loss in Zagreb that ultimately cost the club. In 1956 there was the painful defeat to Red Star by 5 points before Dinamo Zagreb circled back around 2 years later to beat Partizan to the title. The biggest heartbreak came as the 50s ended, however, when the Belgrade teams could only be split by goal difference. Considering that Red Star's Bora Kostic took home the Golden Boot with 25 goals and that Partizan as a team only netted 39, and you could see what exactly hampered them. Partizan finally came back to the fore in 1961, claiming the title from their Belgrade brethren by a single point. It was their first title to be won in their now famous black and white stripes. The Chernobeli, as they were now nicknamed, would enjoy a fruitful 1960s, perhaps the greatest decade in club history. It was in this decade that the Partizanovi Bebe was born, a collection of young players all reaching their peak at the same time in a perfect melting pot of footballing nirvana. Up front there was Milan Galic waiting to pounce and bang in the goals. Farudin Yusufi was a mainstay at right back for both club and country. Velibor Vasovic was just as integral in the heart of the defence for Partizan, as all three were key cogs in the Yugoslav team that reached the 1962 World Cup semi-finals. Milutin Soškić captained the club in goal, and they were joined by the first wave of young talent in Vladica Kovacevic, Vezdan Cebinac and Ilija Matic, as well as Jovan Miljinovic. Whilst Lubomir Mihailovic and Mustana Hasanagic were added to the ranks, Partizan had a team that were freely able to conquer Yugoslavia, and they did. After claiming the 61 title from Red Star by a point, Partizan dismantled what was a weak league the season after, beating Vojvodina by 5 points in a campaign where only 31 points from 22 matches was enough for the title. The gap in 1963 was another 5 points to Dinamo Zagreb with an improved standard, as Partizan lost just 2 games in what completed a hat-trick of titles. As the league slowly grew to a 15-team phenomenon by the 1964-65 season, Partizan were recoiling from their slump to 5th place as they watched neighbours Red Star claim the title for the 7th time. What came next was a staggering reaffirmation of Partizan Belgrade, with the foundations of their 6th Yugoslavian title rooted firmly in a third wave of prodigious young talent. Ivan Kirkovic, Josip Permajer, Branko Razovic and Radislav Becajak had all been nurtured through the ranks and were now entrusted to be senior figures. It was a massacre, 8 points the difference between Partizan in first and Sarajevo in second. It gave Partizan another shot at the European Cup in what would be their 5th attempt in the competition. The question was, would they be able to improve? But before we answer that, I need to tell you about how I watch every single Premier League match completely legally, which means it's VPN time! A VPN hides your IP address, which lets you safeguard your internet connection. So, the absolute opposite of what the Manchester United defence would do. Am I right? No? Okay. And for those who haven't skipped this YouTube advert because you bloody love a bargain, here's why you should choose private internet access, today's video sponsor. 1. They're offering you an insane 83% VPN discounts and 4, count them, 1, 2, 3, 4 months completely free. See it like Manchester City buying Citigroup players for a knockdown price. 2. You can protect an unlimited amount of devices at the same time. Chelsea's transfer strategy for 1. You want 783 devices protected, just buy them all up and protect them. 3. You can access region-restricted content from all over the world 365 days a year. Good news for Spurs fans whose passports are usually back in that cupboard by December. That is private internet access. Links to the discount in the description. Thanks to their place atop the Yugoslavian League when Gabriel Hano dished out the invitations for the inaugural European Cup, Partizan Belgrade were the country's first representatives in the biggest club competition on the continent. If you don't take anything else away from this video, then know this: it was Partizan who inflicted the first European Cup defeat onto Real Madrid when they beat them 3-0 in Belgrade. Unfortunately, it mattered for fuck all, as did Partizan's sticking of 8 goals beyond Sporting in the first round, because Real Madrid had already dispatched the Yugoslavian outfit 4-0 in the Bernabeu first leg. That would be Partizan's last dalliance with the European Cup until the 60s, where they were handed Juventus as a prize for qualifying for the first round. They were promptly pulled out of the tournament thanks to a 7-1 defeat before they lost both games the subsequent season at the preliminaries to CSKA Sofia just as comprehensively. Thankfully, they'd be escaping the purgatory of the earlier rounds, but only because they had been handed a comfortable draw. They'd only beaten Anathorsis Famagusta of Cyprus and Yenes Esh of Luxembourg in reaching the quarter-finals, where they were met by Inter Milan, a team who would go on to win the competition, so they quite handedly disposed of Partizan. Yugoslavia was just about still basking in the afterglow of what had been a successful time of it in the 1950s and early 60s. They'd appeared in the first ever European Championship final, losing to the Soviet Union, whilst they reached only a second ever World Cup semi-final where they were put out by Czechoslovakia. The country had an uphill task of making the '66 World Cup in England, needing a win in Paris in October to stand any chance. Partizan could be seen as a cream of the Yugoslavian crop, providing 9 of their players for the Yugoslav cause in qualification, compared to Red Star and Dinamo Zagreb, who could only provide that number between them. Still, with the league won for a 6th time in the summer of '65, Partizan had earned themselves another crack at the European Cup, and they were faced with a tricky first opponent in Nantes. It would be a stage where both Feyenoord and Fenerbahce fell, but not Partizan, as they romped to a surprisingly convincing 2-0 win over Nantes in Belgrade, thanks to goals either side of the half-time break from Galic and Hasanagic. They'd be given a much tougher time of it in France, as proved when Nantes found the net midway through the first half. However, in this brave new world of the away goals rule, Partizan hit back before the half through Kovacevic, putting one Partizan foot firmly into the last 16, before Galic added a second to put the tie beyond doubt. They would progress 4-2 on aggregate. Werder Bremen were next, as all the big hitters in Real Madrid, Inter Milan, Manchester United and Benfica qualified for the quarter-finals. The Yugoslavians took their time in showing Europe that they were capable of joining them when Yusufi started the goal-scoring spree with 21 minutes left on the clock. Hasanagic found the net in Europe yet again before Permaya ended a devastating 19-minute spell that helped take the first leg away from Bremen. In Bremen, Partizan went down to defeat, but it was only enough to be sold to the West Germans as consolation, as the Belgrade team would be joining aforementioned giants courtesy of a 3-1 aggregate triumph, and they'd avoid each and every one of those giants. As Manchester United picked off Benfica, Inter and Real Madrid forged their own paths to meet in one semi-final, whilst Partizan met Sparta Prague to be the distant 4th wheel in the final 4 of the grand competition. The first leg in Prague started serenely as Hasanagic prodded Partizan into an early lead inside of 16 minutes. The rest of the evening, not so great. Partizan found themselves at the mercy of Andrej Kvasnak, who bagged himself a hat-trick. It wasn't the first defeat the Yugoslavians had suffered in the European Cup that season, but it was the first time they had gone down in the first leg, and by such a margin too. Losing 4-1, Partizan needed a 3-0 triumph at the very least to progress. And what we got was quite possibly one of the greatest comebacks in the latter stages of the European Cup. Partizan swarmed all over their Czech opponents from the off and within 4 minutes had their first goal after Kovacevic's volley in from close quarters. Their second was found after a lovely move which culminated in a cultured finish from Vazovic, clipping the ball over the on-rushing goalkeeper. With 67 minutes left on the clock, Partizan had all this time to find one more goal. In truth, the match would be beyond sight by half-time. Kovacevic got his second and his team's third, tapping in from a cross 6 minutes later before, who else, Hasanagic rounded off the perfect half with a lob after a stupendous 1-2 in the Sparta box. It would be that man to end things late on in the second half, securing the 6-4 aggregate win which gifted Manchester United in the semi-finals. Perhaps against any other team from any other city, Manchester United would be overwhelming favourites, particularly after they had destroyed two-time champions Benfica 5-1 on their own patch in the quarter-finals. Partizan were just another piece of fodder, sitting 6th in the Yugoslav League by the time United turned up to Belgrade. This was the club's first return to the Yugoslav capital since the Munich air disaster, and amongst the United's number who departed after that quarter-final win for the faithful journey 8 years prior, only Bill Foulkes and Bobby Charlton remained on the pitch whilst Matt Busby still stalked the touchline. The English side started well, finding the net through John Connolly, only for the goal to be ruled out. It would be as good as things got for United as Partizan soaked up all their pressure and stung them immediately in the second half via Hasanagic before finding a second on the hour mark. Matt Busby had gambled on the fitness of George Best, who had served him so well in Lisbon, but it had backfired, and whilst United were lucky to escape with a 2-goal defeat, they would still be favourites for progression. Whilst they would have to do so without Best, Partizan knew all about second leg combats, so were well prepared for the visit of Old Trafford. The Yugoslavians remained solid at the back once again, but this time they were broken down thanks to a 75th minute own goal from the goalkeeper. It triggered an almighty wave after wave of English attacks on the Partizan goal in front of the Stretford end. Fortunately for Partizan, they wouldn't concede again, and they snuck into the European Cup final by the smallest of margins. Whoever they met in the final would be another almighty task, and after Real Madrid conquered Inter with a similarly great defensive performance on foreign soil, it would be the 5-time champions of Europe standing across from Partizan in Brussels 3 weeks later. Real had stopped Inter from becoming the first team since them to have won 3 European Cups in a row. Now they were hoping to extend their own record and win the big-eared jug for the 6th time. Despite the seemingly insurmountable task in front of them in a team featuring Paco Gento, Amancio and Piri, Partizan came out to play and were more than deserving of their half-time stalemate. And then some. Velibor Vasovic swung his entire body at a cross and thundered a header beyond the Real Madrid goalkeeper 10 minutes into the second half. Partizan were leading in another fairy tale story, and deservingly so. Except this one didn't have the happy ending that they craved. They were firmly on course to become the first Eastern European team to win the European Cup, and then that inevitability of Real Madrid shone through. As effective in 1966 as it is in today's sport, Amancio got things back on track for the Spaniards with a sublime piece of skill to equalise. He turned his opposing defender inside out with a nutmeg before sending his finish through the goalkeeper's legs too. With 20 minutes to play and 1 goal to be found, it was quickly revealed through Fernando Serena. The right winger absolutely obliterated the ball in his attempts from 25 yards, which flew quickly beyond Soskic. In a flickering of moments, Partizan had gone from holding the European Cup trophy to being just another team, like Fiorentina, Stade de Reims and Frankfurt of this world, to be deeply inferior to the all-white of Real Madrid. Partizan would not be back. A European Cup final, and going ahead in that final to the already anointed Kings of Europe Real Madrid. For a team that placed 11th in the Yugoslav First League, not bad going whatsoever. Now, of course, that position is massively warped by the club's all-encompassing run to the European Cup final. It would remain the standard bearer for Yugoslavian teams in the European Cup until Red Star went one better in 1991. In fact, until then, all Yugoslavian club football had to shout for was Dinamo Zagreb's triumph in the Fairs Cup over Leeds United in 1967. Partizan's manager Abdullah Gegic was allegedly promised the Real Madrid job if he beat the Spaniards in Belgium, Of course he wasn't able to do so, so he didn't get that post, and with that news out of the bag, Gergic left Belgrade and Yugoslavia entirely for Turkey and the Fenerbahce job. Fenerbahce were in the midst of their most successful era, and Gergic would win the club another Turkish league title, but found himself quickly out of the door by the time they had eliminated English champions Manchester City in the European Cup. That honour was bestowed to his immediate successor in Hungarian manager Ignat Molnar. Whilst other countries from behind the Iron Curtain were able to stockpile their talent until a certain age or for their entire career, Yugoslavia wasn't so much behind the Iron Curtain but behind an iron blind where you can twizzle that little stick thing at the side and see through it, or an actual curtain which can be tossed to one side to bring in the light. Moving on quickly from that shite metaphor, Partizan Belgrade were one of the biggest proofs that poaching the talent from an underdog football club at the first sign of their strength is not a modern day phenomenon by any stretch of the imagination. That very summer, Partizan lost their backbone. Soskic was sold to FC Köln, whilst right back Yusufi joined him in the Bundesliga with Eintracht Frankfurt. Kovacevic fled to Nantes and Galic moved to the Belgian league for Standard Liège, but the biggest success could be found through Velibor Vasovic, who moved to Ajax just as they were about to explode into a total footballing beast that changed football. The exodus was completed in the coming years as Razovic and Hasanagic exited in 1969, the former to Borussia Dortmund, the latter to Servette in Switzerland, before Bajic was sold to Lille at the beginning of the 1970s. It was a decade that was largely spent recoiling from the audacity of trying to win something on the biggest stage. Partizan wouldn't win the Yugoslav First League again until 1976, and in their two European Cup campaigns towards the tail end of that decade, they fell at the first hurdle. First to Dynamo Kyiv in 1976, and then to another Dynamo, Dresden, 2 years later. In fact, the closest Partizan ever got to returning to European success was just a little too late to be impactful. As Yugoslavia was falling out of existence as a country and therefore sporting entity, Partizan Belgrade reached the quarter-finals of the Cup Winners' Cup in 1990, ultimately losing to Dinamo Bucharest. And since the dissolution of Yugoslavia, Partizan Belgrade have barely made a footprint on European football. They've only appeared in 2 group stages of the Champions League, failing to win in each of the 12 games in 2003 and 2010, as they were way lower on the pecking order of even clubs like Shakhtar Donetsk and Braga. In fact, this season they completed the unholy treble of playing in each UEFA tournament when they tumbled from the Champions League at the second qualifying stage against Dinamo Kyiv, through the trapdoor of the Europa League thanks to a loss against Lugano before bottoming out in a playoff defeat to Genk in the Conference League. No, they're not a big club anymore, but historically Yugoslavian football was in its pomp in the 50s and 60s, fighting in there amongst the best of the best against Red Star Belgrade, Dinamo Zagreb and Hajduk Split, were the first Eastern team to get to any European Cup final, and it was Partizan. Sadly, their flame burned too briefly. Yeah, Belgrade had a massive impact on European football. For more on that, watch this, the Eastern European champions, featuring Red Star Belgrade as well as Steaua Bucharest.